General organization or general arrangement of the alimentary tract. The process of nutrient intake has 5 phases: ingestion, taking food into the oral cavity; fragmentation, breaking down food into smaller particles by chewing and mixing; digestion, breaking down larger molecules in food into smaller molecules; absorption of end products of digestion; and elimination of waste products. The initial part of the digestive tract is involved in ingestion and fragmentation of food. The middle part is responsible for digestion and absorption, and the end part is responsible for elimination of waste products. The air entering through the nasal cavity and the food entering through the oral cavity has to cross each other to enter their respective pathways. When the food is swallowed, tongue moves backwards, pushing the epiglottis lying behind the tongue backwards and closing up the laryngeal opening, temporarily closing up the airway and allowing food from the oral cavity entering the laryngopharynx, passing through the oropharynx. From the laryngopharynx, food can enter the esophagus and continue down into the stomach. Organs of the alimentary tract. As I said before, the food is ingested into the oral cavity. Inside the oral cavity, food is fragmented by chewing. The fragmented food is mixed with saliva with the help of the tongue, and the food bolus is formed. The swallowed food bolus enters the pharynx and from there the esophagus, and the food bolus is taken towards the stomach by peristaltic movements of the esophagus. Inside the stomach, food is mixed up very well and digested, and the digestion continues into the small intestine, where most of the nutrients in the food, digested food, gets absorbed. And the small intestine has 3 parts: the duodenum, jejunum, and the ileum. From the small intestine, food enters the large intestine. At the large intestine, it is water that is mainly gets absorbed. Large intestine has a cecum, ascending colon, transverse colon, and a descending colon. From the descending colon, food enters the sigmoid colon and stored in the rectum temporarily till it can be voided through the anus. There are several accessory organs of the digestive tract. Salivary glands are connected up with the oral cavity and they secrete saliva into the oral cavity. Liver, gallbladder, and pancreas open into the first part of the small intestine, which is the duodenum. The accessory glands of the digestive tract develop as invaginations of the inner lining of the digestive tract. Alimentary canal is a muscular tube lined inside with a mucous membrane and covered for the most part with a serosa outside. In certain parts, it is covered by an adventitia instead of a serosa. Now we are going to take a look at the general arrangement of the wall of the alimentary tract as seen in a cross section. If we start from inside in a cross section, the first layer we find is the mucosa. Mucosa has got 3 layers: the inner epithelium, the lamina propria, and the outer muscularis mucosa. From the oral cavity to the end of the esophagus, it is stratified squamous non-keratinizing epithelium. This is to withstand the frictional forces generated by the solid food bolus. From the stomach to the rectum, the epithelium is simple columnar. Simple columnar epithelium is useful to absorb nutrients from the digested food. Again, the epithelium is transformed back into stratified squamous non-keratinizing in the anal canal to withstand frictional forces generated by the fecal matter. Lamina propria is a loose supporting connective tissue layer rich in blood supply and lymphatic supply. Cells of the immune system such as lymphocytes and plasma cells are found in the lamina propria, like in any other ordinary connective tissue. In the ileum, there are large lymphoid aggregations called Peyer's patches in the lamina propria. Muscularis mucosa is the deepest layer of the mucosa. This is formed by smooth muscles. The muscularis mucosa is responsible for the folding of the mucosa and increasing the contact between the epithelium and the luminal contents. It is also responsible for expelling secretions from the mucous glands in the mucosa. This is a histology slide prepared from a cross-section of the esophagus. This is the luminal side. You can see the thickness of the mucosa here, which consists of an epithelium, lamina propria, and a muscularis mucosa. The epithelium consists of stratified squamous non-keratinizing epithelium here, and the lamina propria, as you can see, is formed by loose connective tissues, and the muscularis mucosa is formed by smooth muscles. Below the mucosa, you can see a much thicker submucosa here. Now we will add submucosa to our previous picture of mucosa. Submucosa is a thick layer of connective tissue consisting of collagen fibers and adipose tissue. It contains larger blood vessels, lymphatics, nerves, and submucosal glands. And this is the layer that binds the inner mucosal layer to the outer muscular wall. Now we will add the muscularis propria or muscularis externa or outer smooth muscle layer of the gut wall to our picture. This layer consists of two layers of smooth muscles, the inner circular layer of smooth muscles and the outer longitudinal layer of smooth muscles. In a cross-section like this, the muscle fibers in the inner circular layer are cut in longitudinal direction, and the muscle fibers in the outer longitudinal layer are cut in cross-section. In this longitudinal section of the esophagus, you can identify the mucosa consisting of the epithelium, lamina propria, and the muscularis mucosa. Submucosa, muscularis propria or muscularis externa. You can see here the circular muscle layer in the muscularis propria is cut in cross section and the longitudinal layer is cut in longitudinal direction, since this is a longitudinal section. Further, you can identify the outermost layer of the gut tube, which is in this case the adventitia. We will take it up later in our discussion. When it comes to the wall of the stomach, in the muscularis propria, there is an innermost oblique layer, other than the inner circular and outer longitudinal layers. When it comes to the colon, the longitudinal layer has separated out into three ribbons, which are called taenia coli. Taenia coli is an identification feature of the colon. Now we will add the final layer to our cross section. It is the adventitia or the serosa. When the gut tube is not covered with the peritoneal covering, it has only got a connective tissue layer outside without an epithelium. Then it is called adventitia. In places where there is a peritoneal covering, it forms a serosa around the gut tube with an outer epithelium. Good example is the esophagus. In the esophagus, since it passes through the posterior mediastinum in between the pleurae and the pericardial tissues, there is no serosa but an adventitia. When it comes to the small intestine, which lies in the peritoneal cavity covered by peritoneum, it has got a serosa. The epithelium of the serosa is called a mesothelium. When there is an adventitia, it is continuous with the surrounding connective tissues. Look at this diagram carefully. In most of its length, the gut tube lies in a peritoneal cavity, attached to its wall by a mesentery. But in certain places, the gut tube passes behind the peritoneum, like in this case. Here, it is called retroperitoneum because it lies behind the peritoneum. In a case like this, there is an adventitia covering the gut tube. In a case like this, where the gut tube lies in the peritoneal cavity, it is covered by a serosa. In this image, you can identify the small intestine here and the mesentery of the small intestine here. This is the posterior abdominal wall and the structures lying behind the peritoneum, which are retroperitoneum. Now this mesentery here is formed by two layers. One layer on this side and another layer on the other side. So it is double layered. And this mesentery carries blood vessels, lymphatics, nerves from the posterior wall to the gut tube. When the outer layer of the mesentery passes over the gut tube, it forms a serosa. Now we will summarize what we have learned so far. The inner layer of the gut wall is called mucosa. It has got three layers: the epithelium, lamina propria, and the muscularis mucosa. The second layer is called submucosa. The third layer is called muscularis propria or muscularis externa. It consists of an inner circular smooth muscle layer and an outer longitudinal smooth muscle layer. The outermost layer is either an adventitial layer or a serosal layer. In the lamina propria of the mucosa, there are lymphoid aggregations. This is obvious in places like the ileum, where there are large aggregations of lymphoid tissue which are called Peyer's patches. In the submucosa, there are submucosal glands. In places like the duodenum, there are numerous submucosal glands. The nervous system, the part of the nervous system that controls the gut, is called enteric nervous system. The enteric nervous system consists of two nerve plexus. One is called submucosal plexus or Meissner's plexus. It is responsible for the contraction of the muscles of the muscularis mucosa and responsible for the secretion of the glands there and the shape of the inner layer of the gut, inner surface of the gut. There is another nerve plexus which is called myenteric plexus or Auerbach plexus, which is located between the circular and longitudinal smooth muscle layers of the muscularis propria. It is responsible for the peristaltic movements by rhythmic contraction of circular and longitudinal smooth muscle layers.